I'm going to jump in here really quick before we get into the podcast to let you know that there are a few changes going on with CV Ministries. One of the biggest is that we are relocating our office. And honestly, I really don't want to move all of our inventory. So if you want an opportunity to put together a training library for your team, or as you onboard new members to be able to provide them resources to get going, now is a great opportunity. Everything on our website is 50% off now through Easter, only while supplies last. So why not take advantage of this opportunity to expand your training and serving resources? You can take advantage of this savings and the opportunity by going to our website at www.cv-ministries.com. And within the website, you'll see our store there. Go in there, and anything that we have is going to be 50% off with promo code CV2021. Again, that's CV2021. This is part 2 of last week's podcast.
A well-managed and directed safety ministry uses that emergency response plan as the core of their training program, and their safety team learns what's in it.
Welcome to CV Ministries Church Security Through Prevention podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Blevins. I'm really excited to bring this podcast to you today. My guest today is Paul Lake. Paul has an extensive background in a lot of different areas, but what I think is most impressive is the heart for service that he has for the safety ministry in our churches. There are very few safety and security leaders around the country that I would consider to be a standard for others to glean from, but after talking to Paul today, he is definitely among those leaders. I hope this two-part conversation will help you get going in developing an emergency action plan for your house of worship, or dust off and update the one that you already have. As usual, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast, as well as do a Google review for us. We always appreciate that. So let's get going and spend some time with Paul talking about emergency action plans.
How are you going to deal with the concealed handgun situation? Is it legal in your state? Is it not? How are you going to deal with somebody brandishing a weapon, whether there's actual gunfire involved or not? What are you going to do with a bomb threat on campus? All of that type of stuff. So those are a few of the things you got to think about dealing with registered sex offenders. What about a transient on campus? All that different stuff. And then I also include in the emergency response plans that I deal with people exhibits that deal with different things, one of which would be listing the members of your critical response team. Critical response team is different than your safety team. Most people don't even think about that, but what is your plan for dealing with your church bus that is on a trip to a different state with 35 of your youth and 6 adults, for instance, and it gets T-boned and several people are deceased and others injured? How does your church respond to that? What's the plan for how that's handled? Your church floods and is now contaminated with sewage water for whatever reason, and it's uninhabitable. How does your church handle that? That's where a crisis response team comes in. There's not immediate action on the campus always necessary, but who are the people responsible for dealing with the media, dealing with the incident itself, dealing with the families that are affected as a result of this crisis, all that. That's a crisis response team, and it's independent and different from your safety team, in my opinion. How do you notify the congregation that you have an emergency? So there's a weather alert, tornadoes on the ground, 35 miles south, headed north to your direction at 25 miles an hour, and you have to make a decision on how and when to evacuate. How does that information pass along from the safety team to the pastor or whoever's on the stage? How is that information then communicated to the congregation so that there's not a panic and an orderly evacuation of the premises and to the right place. Where is that right place? How is it identified to begin with? Who is watching for that event? And then who transmits that information and how does it get transmitted? And then where do they go? So there's basically two types of evacuations. You've got an evacuation that is a result of some type of threat on the outside that's worse than what's going on inside. So that requires you to shelter in place, just like the example I gave of the tornado. And you have an outside evacuation because there's something on the inside of the church that's more hazardous than what's going on outside. And that could be a fire, could be a chemical leak, it could be an active shooter inside the church. So where are your safe zones both inside the church and where are they outside the church? And how do you get people from one point to the other? That's all in your emergency response plan. And you need to drill down far enough to cover things like once you've had a fire identified and you've evacuated your people and you've already set up these pre-established safe zones and you've gotten them safely out of the building and they're all gathered in these different zones outside in the parking lot, where is the smoke from the building blowing? And what chemicals are being produced by the fire? Do you then just leave everybody there, or do you have a plan for relocating them because they're in the smoke stream? Stuff like that. So you need to have your weather rooms identified, shelter in place rooms identified, how and what needs to be stocked in those rooms. Where are your first aid kits? What's in them? What's your process for keeping them up to date? That kind of stuff. Do you have a bomb threat checklist, a report form, any of that kind of stuff? Does your media team have the ability to put up slides or graphics that help with your announcements to evacuate in or out, that kind of thing? So those are all the different types of components that go into an emergency response plan. There's probably even more than that, but that's kind of the core of it. And if you get that much covered, then you got a pretty good start. And from that, you need to establish where that fits in your safety team's training program, and then how often is it reviewed and updated.
Yeah, two things come to mind as you talk about that. Is one is I can remember doing when I was on staff at my church years ago, doing the backbones to a lot of that. And what I really wonder is where is it at now, and who's reviewed it, and has it been updated at all or anything like that? Because I kind of doubt it. And it is another thing that comes to mind too is so many churches are looking for training ideas, and I often tell them, you can. There's so many ideas that just come out of this alone. If you're just doing this alone, this is really, there's so many training aspects that can spin off of this on that. The other thing too is that came to mind was that I have to realize and think about too is that there's nothing cookie cutter about this. Not one size fits all. And if you have a multi-site facility, you're doing this for each site independently. There's going to be aspects of that are going to stay the same, some of the core, but then you've still got to take the time and look at each one of your sites for that. Our church has 4 different sites, and that means each one of those, each one of those should have their own independent on that. And I think a lot of times I could easily see, it happening to where people just, cookie cutter it to the next one and say, just adapt it to your site, just wing it or kind of thing, instead of seriously taking it and saying, okay, how can we apply it to this?
Well, that cookie cutter approach can be pretty dangerous, as you've alluded to, because first of all, it will prove to the legal system that church was not, that specific site was not actually evaluated and the plan wasn't built specifically for it. Also, it lends itself to people just saying, okay, we got a plan, let's stick it on the shelf and move on, because nobody actually spent that time to customize it to that particular church campus. And so, yeah, those are dangerous practices, and that's why any document you get, even if it's the one that comes out of my church safety starter kit, is all designed to give you the core elements and then modify it for your specific campus. But that means you have to go through the process. Those are tools to just help you think of the things that we just talked about. What am I supposed to be addressing in this emergency response plan, and then make it specific for your church. And then the reason I keep harping on the fact that you need to make that the core of your safety team's training program is that's the group of people who are supposed to know what's in this plan. Staff needs to know it as well, but your safety team people are the ones who, if they do it the way I teach it anyway, will take the emergency response plan, make it the core of a training manual for their own team, and then train to that standard of what those things in that emergency response plan say are supposed to happen. And then you train not just what to do, but how to do it, obviously. And you mentioned this, which is actually a very important aspect, is that those things that are in there are your training topics. How do you evacuate in the case of a fire? I just taught an 8-hour class in South Texas this past weekend, and when I do the reality-based advanced class like this, we do everything or most everything in real time, high speed, high stress. And this was a team that's been around for a while, and I have all the toys, bells and whistles, and I had a smoke machine that I set up before the class started, so nobody even knew it was in the room. And it was sitting right behind the monitor up in front where I was teaching the class. And one of the scenarios, I had all the safety team in their place, and I just pushed a remote button, and all of a sudden smoke starts boiling out from the stage. And so they run in, see that it's a fire. Somebody brings in a fire extinguisher, the whole 9 yards. And by the time I called index, they were all trying to prep to put the fire out. And no one had dialed 911, and no one had tried to evacuate anybody from the building. And so you can get focused on things that look important at the time. It's the fire department's job to put the fire out, unless it's just really small. It's your job to make people safe and get them to safety. And so practicing that simple, most likely event, fire somewhere in the building, how do you evacuate people in a fire, is rarely ever done by teams. How do you get them out? How do you make them follow you? Where are they going? How do you establish a chain of safety officers from the evacuation point to the evacuation destination to make sure people are get there? What are you going to do with the people who say, I'm going back for my purse, or I'm going back for my Bible, or I'm going to get my child in the next room, or whatever? Those are all issues you got to deal with in the training phase so that you're not taken by surprise by it when it happens in the real world.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think even in part of that, and this is something that I've tried to encourage even at our own church, to where you incorporate in that the example you just gave, to where you incorporate the ushers or the greeters in that too. What is their role in that if they're in an evacuation situation? Are they opening the doors? Are they arms out, pointing people in the right direction to help? Because we know, as we know, that the safety team aspect is usually pretty thin and can't cover everywhere for most churches. The other thing too that I find as I talk with churches around the country that they don't even think about, particularly when they're evacuating children, is that whole reunification process as well, because that can get very dangerous, and the potential for a child to get taken or whatever, or the wrong child to get the whole reunification. I did a podcast with a a children's director, and she basically said, a parent will revert to like a fifth grade mentality in an emergency just to get to their child. They're
Oh
not
yeah.
hearing much. They're not, so from a safety team standpoint, we've got to think of that too. How are we creating a safe environment for that reunification process? In this whole process, we often think about the evac. What do we think about reuniting or the reunification? Because more than likely, the kids area may have dumped out of the building into a different area than what we have the adults, and we might move those, together at some point or have a process to do that. What is that process? We just want to take a quick break here to let you know how to contact us and where to find out more about our national seminar. I see communities that may know why church security is important, but they may not be doing anything about it or don't know how to do it well. Our national seminars are for ushers, greeters, children's workers, staff, volunteers, your security teams, and other ministries in your community. We say that this is a level 1 training that is designed to help equip you to serve well in your various ministries while maintaining a safe place for people to come. Getting churches on the same or similar page when it comes to security will only make the community safer as well. The easiest way to find out more information or to contact us is to go to cv-ministries.com. There you'll find a variety of training DVDs and books, with more being developed all the time. There's also a place at the bottom of the page where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter and to be able to get more information. We would love your feedback on topics or guests that you would like to hear on future podcasts. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's get back to the podcast.
Well, and that's all part of, and clearly you're probably not going to be able to put every single step of that in an emergency response plan,
Right.
But you do identify the issues, just like you raised there, and you clearly identify that fire evacuation, for instance, is a common issue that needs to be trained to. And when you incorporate your ushers and greeters or other people into that plan, then you have to recognize that if they are going to be effective and not a hindrance, they have to be trained just like your safety team, which means you need to incorporate them into your routine training program. And all of that has to culminate in not only a safe evacuation, but an accountability of people to make sure that everybody has been evacuated. And then, as you mentioned, to the reunification of the people on the other end. And the evacuation as it crosses inbound emergency services travel lanes, for instance. How are you getting people across? I mean, because Sunday morning, and I joke about this in my basic class, who's on duty in your police departments, fire departments on Sunday mornings? It's not the veterans that have been doing the job for 30 years that are cool, calm, and collected. It's your rookies, because they don't get that. That's the prime time that everybody wants off. And so the people that are low on the totem pole will get that. Now, I joke about that because they're not going to be unsafe, but you are going to get fresh recruits for a lot of the times rolling into the parking lot hot, coming to this event, whether it's a fire or an active shooter or whatever, and you're trying to get people out of the building. You're crossing their inbound lanes often. Have you accounted for that? And how do you deal with that? So and all we're talking about here for the last several minutes has been a fire. Right. Every other of these topics that we threw out there earlier have that drill down capability with regards to what should happen, and sometimes even more importantly, what shouldn't happen, who should be involved in it. And then there's a whole other level of procedures out there that I call standard operating procedures for the safety team that are not what to do, which is what an emergency response plan, emergency action plan tells you. This is what you do. There's another document that should be developed eventually that tells you how to do those things and how to conduct yourself when you do those things. And that's standard operating procedures. Don't want to really confuse today's topic with that, but I'm just saying that the point where I think we're trying to make today, at least from my perspective, is this concept of an emergency action plan is an important one, and it's a complex one, and it is important enough that you need to take the time to do it right and not just throw it together and then stick it on the shelf and think that's a magic bullet that saves you in the future. If your people aren't trained to it, um, it can actually be to your detriment to have identified all those things and then not trained to it.
And I know we've talked about, that it's important that the safety team knows what it says in that safety action plan. And we've talked about that there's staff that needs to. Can you go into a little bit more detail on what does that look like? Who should know about the safety action plan?
Well, let's just say, let's start with a small church that has no safety team. And it still needs an emergency response plan because somebody needs to know what to do when the thing happens, right? So that's going to typically be a staff led project where the staff, uh, your pastor, executive pastor, and some small churches won't even have an executive pastor. You'll have a ministry leader of the youth or whatever, maybe a worship leader. Those people who gather together regularly to administer the functions of the church then become the bearers of the emergency response plan because they're the only ones that are there consistent with the program, and they need to know. All right, so let's build it up now to a church that has a small safety team. Then clearly the safety team needs to be in on that and be the not just the ones who know it, but incorporate it into their training program. They need to be the keepers of the flame. This is my opinion now. There's nothing out there in the world of church safety that says this is exactly the way it needs to happen. But for your consideration, I would say that this is the process you need to seriously consider. Make sure your emergency response plan is monitored in addition to being used as part of the core of the training program and updated by your safety team on a regular basis. And then as you move out from there, and as you mentioned earlier, if you can incorporate your ushers and greeters into knowing that, I mean, that's a tall order in most churches, in my experience, to get your ushers and greeters to be that involved in your safety program and have them be intimately familiar with what's an emergency response plan. But quite frankly, if you could wave a magic wand and have staff, safety team, and your ushers and greeters all on the same page with what's in that manual, that would be excellent. Just hard
I
to.
think, yeah, I agree. And I think you're absolutely right. It's hard to get them. And I think it needs to get for when you're talking about those external ministries, let's say, your ushers, greeters, your children's workers, whether they're staff or volunteers, that it needs to be broken out into something that is very simple and very understandable. I know our ushers and greeters, they're begging for training. They're begging for, like, if something were to happen, what do we do? We need to know, what do we do in that situation? What is our role to helping you? They have that mentality, which is great. And you're right, not all do have
Right.
that. I've
Yeah.
talked to other churches where, the ushers have probably been ushers since, Moses, and, they know their role. They don't want to do anything else. This is exactly what they want to do. Well, that's not exactly healthy in today's church or day and age. With that almost becomes more problematic in a situation than it becomes helpful.
No, you're absolutely right. And I've seen both ends and extremes of that spectrum. The team that I just taught this past weekend that I mentioned earlier was, and my co instructor and I kind of mused about the fact that it was a unicorn, because that it had a large safety team, a fairly large church, and it had received a grant dedicated to safety, and a fairly large grant. And they have already planned their year out, and their training, and their people are all excited, and they have senior leadership is on board, and they're going to incorporate the peripheral people like we talked about in their plan, the ushers and greeters, the whole 9 yards. And there's no pushback from the senior level. As a matter of fact, pastor and other leaders are on not only on board but are helping push the program. And that's such an unusual set of circumstances. It's sad to say, but um, a lot of times I find uh, lower level members only of a church who see the need for a safety program, and they're coming to me and asking for help. And their first questions are, how do I get my pastor on board? He doesn't see the need. And so, sadly, if you're having to push that rope up a hill, it's really difficult to get a safety program in place. And so, hopefully, programs like this and others that are out there across the country, and with the high-profile incidents that are occurring, we will see more and more pastors getting on board and not being a hindrance, but being an actual advocate of development of a safety ministry. If they can catch the vision that these people that have already shown, and when I say these people, I'm talking about those that volunteer to be part of the safety team, have shown a desire to serve and have shown the desire to serve above and beyond the typical come to church type of involvement, but maybe even to put their lives at risk at times, can be a vital part of the ministry. And I referred to that earlier as the tip of the spear of the ministry. Then it can make a difference in their perspective, because why would you spend the time to train a group of people how to look for hurting people if they're not then equipped to minister to those hurting people? And so my concept for teaching other churches about how to develop their team is use the principles out of Timothy for a deacon and elder as your selection criteria.
Amen.
When you're looking for people to be part of your safety team, don't stand in the pulpit and say, anybody with a license to carry, come on down and be a part of the church safety team, or whatever your state allows. That's not your selection process. Watch people as they plug into other ministries, walk alongside people in the church and see that they fit that Timothy criteria, and then put your hand on their shoulder and say, would you be interested in what we do? And then put them through a process for my own team. And what I recommend is that they then get a package from me in an email that has our safety training manual, and it's 70 something pages. It's a book, and they're required to read through that with all the requirements, and it includes the emergency response plan in the middle of it, and the application is buried on page 30 something, so they've got to read the whole thing to get the application. Then they have to turn the application back in a reasonable amount of time. It's a specified amount of time, actually. And if they don't do that, that's a clue that they're not really that interested. Then they've got to pass the background check and the reference check and all that kind of stuff. And then they have to set for a board review. And that board review is just a 7 or so of tenured members of the safety team asking open-ended questions. And usually my first question is, I want to hear your salvation story. Tell me how you come to know the Lord. If you can't articulate your own testimony, it's going to be hard for you to minister to somebody else. And those are all just pre-screening for how to get somebody on the team, and then you put them through basic training and all that kind of stuff. So the higher the bar, the higher level of quality you get in candidates is a principle I try to operate on. Now, I understand that some small churches just getting started have a difficult time setting a really high bar, or they won't have anybody. That's okay. But make that your long-term plan, is to screen your people and get good quality people, and then emphasize the importance of ministry as much as the details and the tactics and strategy of doing a safety job.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's the big difference between us and your local law enforcement, is the ministry aspect of it. We are not law enforcement. It is about ministry.
And I tell people that all the time. I ask the question, and of course, I teach across all sorts of faith-based organizations. But when I'm teaching in a Christian church, I ask that question: what do we have in our tool belt that the rest of the security and law enforcement world as a whole doesn't typically have? And occasionally I'll get an answer. Most of the time I'm just a deer in the headlights look, but it's the ministry of the Holy Spirit. And so if you have a personal relationship with the Lord, that is an aspect that allows us to stay tuned into a really important notification system, for lack of a better word. But that also requires us, if we want to be sensitive to that, we've got to be in a close personal walk with the Lord, right? You can't just have the landline. You got to be connected to the service, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so that's just one way to emphasize the importance of not only your personal walk with the Lord, but how important ministry is. I mean, I have an example in my own team from not too long ago. I guess it's been a couple of years now, where we had a gentleman come through the front door on a Sunday that I wasn't even actually there. And he was dressed in a hoodie with his hands in his pockets and his head down. Didn't greet anybody, wouldn't talk to anybody, could clearly distraught and brand new, never been seen by anybody in our church. So he was on the radar of our safety team. Clearly, he had two new best friends with him all day. He just didn't know he had those two new best friends. At the end of the service, he didn't get up and leave. He sat right in the middle of a pew right down front. So they stayed with him and kind of approached him afterwards in a compassionate way and began to talk to him and prayed with him and led him to the Lord. And a year later, well, shortly after that, he started visiting our Tuesday night men's group. And a year later, the topic came up, and he mentioned that day and how those guys helped lead him to the Lord. And we told him those were safety officers. And that was the first time a year later that he understood that those were licensed personal protection officers who were carrying weapons, who had been assigned to him because he was a suspicious person. But then they ended up leading him to the Lord, and he never knew their role in the church until a year later. And then he was so taken by that he became interested in being part of our safety team. And now a year later after that, he actually joined the team and come full circle. So that's the part of where ministry is so important, and where we are required to walk a very tight balance between all the things that look hard to the outside public with the things that are open and inviting on the ministry end as safety officers for the church.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of the role that we play. I often challenge. Well, I lead a men's group, but besides that, I challenge people all the time. I use the example of manna, that if I'm not picking up my manna every day, then I'm going to go hungry. And if I go hungry, then I'm not prepared to do what I need to do. Whatever God calls me to do, I'm not prepared to do that. I'm probably not going to be as fit spiritually or physically to do it, in attitude, in my emotions, or whatever the case is. And if you remember in the Bible, the manna was only good for that day. We got to pick it up the next day too.
Except on Saturday, or except on the day before the Sabbath, whatever that was in those days, and then it was good for 2 days.
That's right.
They were required to rely on that, which is a great principle, every day. So that's a good example.
Yeah. I tell people, I said, if I have a 6 a.m. flight out of Denver, I'm not getting up at 3 a.m. My manna just might look different that day. For the hour and a half drive I need to get to Denver and get checked in and everything, it's not going to happen. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to starve all day. I'm still going to pick up my manna at some point throughout the day on that. Well, Paul, I really appreciate you taking your time today for this. I think this is a very important subject. I really am encouraged by what there's churches all over the country that I get to talk with, as do you. And, like you talked about the unicorn, I love what you're doing in your church and the standard that you're setting. I think the way you described it, that's a standard that I'd love to see churches around the country pick up and do. It's not, we need to set that bar higher than what we do in many aspects of churches and in the security and safety aspect of it. And very encouraging to hear to what you're doing out there in your church and what you're encouraging other churches around the country to do as well. What we'll do is I almost always get feedback from people after they've heard the podcast, wanting more information or whatever. And if I get it, I'll definitely forward it your way. We'll have a link to your website so they can get more information. We'll put that in the show notes as well. But before we go, why don't you go ahead and give us your email and your website, just so that those that may not see it in the show notes can at least have it.
Sure. Email is my first name, Paul, Paul, and at Century One Consulting. And Century is spelled a little different than most people think. It's SENTRYONE and the word consulting altogether.com. And then the website is the same. It's www.centuryoneconsulting.com. And they'll be able to get there and get through all the information that way easy enough. On my emails there on the website as well.
Yeah, I would encourage anybody that's looking for help in getting started or wanting to strengthen what you're doing to reach out to Paul. There's a lot of us that kind of do similar, but we're all a little bit different in how we train and how we do our seminars around the country. And what Paul's doing is a great thing out there in Texas, and willing to go anywhere that he needs to go to further this ministry, both for God and for the safety of others. Like we joke about, we've read the back of the book. We know we win. We just have to get as many people to God as safely as possible. And so I just really appreciate what you're doing, and maybe we'll be able to do this again sometime with a different subject. And I'm open to it. So whatever suggestions you might have down the road, I'd love to do it and see. And I think this was an important one to cover today and on that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for taking time to listen to this podcast. If you really enjoyed it and you found it of benefit to you, we really appreciate your feedback. There's several different ways that you can provide us feedback. One of them is to subscribe to the podcast. It's to share it with others. And another is to contact us directly, particularly if you have any questions or concerns, or you want more information on how to host a seminar in your community. You can contact me directly at danielblevins@cv@heart.com, or you can go to our website. That's cv-ministries.com. Both of those will get you in the right direction. Until next time, make sure that you're out there protecting the flock with a heart of service.